This is the Quadratics Progress Check 2 summary video for intermediate algebra. In this video and on this next progress check, we're going to be focusing on solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. You won't have to memorize the quadratic formula. It will be provided for you on the progress check. At this point, it should also have shown up multiple times in your notes as well. When you're using the quadratic formula, you want to follow these guidelines. First, you have to make sure that the equation is equal to 0. And then you want to identify a, b, and c values by following these rules. A is always the number in front of x squared, b is always the number in front of the x, and c is always the number by itself. In class, we also talked about the discriminant and how it's useful to calculate just what's under the square root in order to get a feel for what your solutions are going to look like. Sometimes it's helpful to do this before you do anything else, because it lets you know whether you'll have two solutions, whether you'll only have one solution, or possibly not have any solutions at all. So let's take a look at this first example. Our first step is to make sure that the equation is equal to 0, and so we'll do that by adding 25 to both sides. Next, we would want to identify our a, b, and c values. A is the number in front of the x squared, b is the number in front of the x, and c is the constant value that has no variable next to it. So in this case, a is 4, b is 8, and c is 25. Next, I'll find the discriminant so that I can tell what kind of solutions I'm going to get. b squared minus 4ac would give us 8 squared minus 4 times 8 times 25, and that calculates to negative 336. Looking at my discriminant table, that's a negative number, and so I'll have no real solutions. At this point, there's no need for me to take this process any further because I already know that I'm going to end up having to take the square root of a negative in the process. Example 2, we'll start the same way. We want to make sure that the rule is equal to 0. We can accomplish that by subtracting 15x from both sides. Next, we want to identify our a, b, and c values. In this case, a is 2, b is negative 15, and c is negative 50. Next, I'll find the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac. So our b value is negative 15, so we'll start with negative 15 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 50. And the result of that is not 345, but 625. You'll have to forgive me through part of this because I realized the first time I was making the video that I had made a mistake and I had to go back and make some changes. So my discriminant should be 625, which is a perfect square number. That tells me that I'm going to end up with two whole number solutions. So now I'm going to go ahead and set up the quadratic formula. The first fraction is the opposite of b over 2a, so that would be positive 15 over 2 times 2. And then the part that's under the square root is the part that we've already calculated. That's the discriminant. So I'm going to take that 625 and write that under the square root. Next, I'll simplify top and bottom of each fraction. So in the first fraction, I get 15 over 4. And in the second fraction, I get 25 over 4. 25 comes from taking the square root of 625. At this point, I can branch off into my two solutions. Both of them will have 4 as our common denominator. And so for the first fraction, I'll have to do 15 plus 25, which is not 33.6, it's 40. And then for my next step, I'll have to do 15 minus 25, which is not negative 3.6, it's negative 10. And so these final answers will change as well as I was fixing all my mistakes. 40 divided by 4 gives me 10. And negative 10 divided by 4 gives me negative 2.5. So those are my two solutions. All right, one more example. Usually we would start by making the equation equal to 0, but in this case the equation is already equal to 0. So now I can go straight to identifying my a, b, and c values. A is 1, b is 8, and c is 16. I'll find the discriminant next, b squared minus 4ac. So that would be a squared minus 4 times 1 times 16, which gives me a result of 0. That tells me that I'm only going to end up with one solution in this case instead of two. So I'll set up my quadratic formula, filling in all the appropriate information. We'll do the opposite of b. Our b value was positive 8, and so the opposite of that is negative 8. And then in the denominator we have 2 times 1. 1 was our a value. And the denominators of our fractions match. Then underneath the square root, I'll put what we found for the discriminant, which was 0. I'll simplify top and bottom of each fraction. The square root of 0 is just 0. And anytime you take 0 and divide it by anything, the result is 0. So my single solution is going to come just from the first fraction, negative 8 divided by 2. So the final result is negative 4.